Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Rosie, and thanks for joining me on Elevating Glow. Nobody talks enough about how lonely growth can feel. Not the motivational version of growth, not the social media version, the real version. The version where your old life no longer fits, but your new life hasn't fully formed yet. The version where you start changing internally, and suddenly the people around you don't quite know how to connect with you anymore. Because becoming someone new often requires grieving the places where the old versions of you once belonged. Welcome back to Roots and Wings. Today's episode is called The Loneliness of Becoming Someone New. Because growth is beautiful, but it can also feel incredibly isolating when your healing starts changing your relationships, your habits, your mindset, and even your sense of identity. There's a strange kind of loneliness that happens during transformation. You start noticing things you didn't notice before. Conversations that drain you, relationships built on unhealthy patterns, environments that keep you emotionally stuck. And suddenly, the version of you that used to fit there doesn't anymore. That realization can feel heartbreaking, because growth often creates emotional distance before it creates clarity. Sometimes you stop relating to the people you once felt deeply connected to. Not because you think you're better than them, but because you're no longer surviving in the same emotional patterns together. And that shift changes everything. Healing changes your tolerance. You stop tolerating constant disrespect. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop shrinking your needs to keep relationships comfortable. And while those changes are healthy, they can also feel incredibly lonely at first. Because not everyone grows with you. Some people only knew how to connect with the version of you that lacked boundaries. The version that overgave. The version that stayed silent. The version that accepted emotional inconsistency. And when you change, the relationship changes too. Sometimes people celebrate your growth. Sometimes they resist it. And sometimes they quietly drift away because your healing no longer supports the dynamic they benefited from. That hurts. Especially when you genuinely cared about those relationships. But growth has a way of exposing which connections were rooted in authenticity and which were rooted in emotional familiarity. Many of us confuse familiarity with compatibility. We stay connected to people because they feel emotionally familiar, even if the dynamic is unhealthy. Chaos can feel familiar. Emotional unavailability can feel familiar. Being needed can feel familiar. And healing disrupts that familiarity. Suddenly, peace feels unfamiliar. Boundaries feel uncomfortable. Healthy communication feels awkward. you begin realizing how much of your old life was built around emotional survival instead of emotional alignment. That awareness can create loneliness before it creates freedom. I think one of the hardest parts of growth is realizing you can outgrow spaces you once prayed to belong in. Friend groups, relationships, even old versions of yourself. And there's grief in that. Real grief. Because healing often involves mourning people who are still alive, but no longer emotionally aligned with who you're becoming. That kind of grief is complicated. You miss them, but you also know returning to old patterns would cost you your peace. So you stand in the middle, not fully connected to your past anymore, but not fully settled into your future either. That middle space can feel incredibly empty. But it's also where transformation happens. Roots grow underground before anyone sees evidence of change above the surface. And many healing seasons feel exactly like that. Quiet, invisible, lonely, but necessary. Because becoming someone new requires enough distance from your old identity to finally hear your own voice clearly. And eventually, the loneliness changes. It stops feeling like abandonment and starts feeling like alignment. You begin attracting healthier connections, safer conversations, more honest relationships. Not because you became perfect, but because you stopped betraying yourself just to avoid being alone. And that changes the kind of people your life can hold. If growth has felt lonely lately, it doesn't mean you're failing. Sometimes loneliness is simply the space between who you were and who you're becoming. And while that space can feel painful, it's also sacred. Because you are building a life rooted in truth instead of survival. Thanks for listening to Roots and Wings. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's struggling with the loneliness that often comes with healing and personal growth. And remember, not every season of growth looks beautiful while you're living through it. Sometimes, roots are growing in places nobody else can see yet. Until next time, elevate and glow.